My name is Emma, and this is the story of how my world turned upside down in a single day, and how I fought back to reclaim what was rightfully mine. It all started 3 years ago when my dad married Linda. I was 22 then, fresh out of college with a marketing degree and finally feeling like I was finding my place in the world. Dad seemed happier than he had been since Mom died when I was 15. He had been alone for 7 years, pouring himself into his work and raising me, and I was genuinely glad to see him smile again. Linda was a divorced nurse who worked at the local hospital, and she seemed kind and caring when they first started dating. Linda brought 2 kids into our family, Marcus, who was 24 and working sporadically in retail, and Stephanie, who was 21 and had dropped out of college after her first semester. At first, I thought we could all get along and create the kind of blended family you see in movies. I was excited about having siblings after being an only child for so long. Boy, was I naive. The warning signs started during the engagement period, but I was too optimistic to pay attention to them. Marcus would make snide comments about how Dad was spoiling me, even though I had been working part-time jobs since I was 16 and paying for most of my own expenses. Stephanie would roll her eyes whenever Dad and I shared inside jokes or talked about memories from before Linda came into our lives. But Dad seemed so happy that I convinced myself these were just normal growing pains of families coming together. From day one after the wedding, Marcus and Stephanie made it clear they saw me as an outsider in what they considered their new kingdom. Dad owned a successful construction company that he had built from nothing over the past 25 years. He started with just a pickup truck and a toolbox, working as a handyman while raising me as a single father. Through hard work, integrity, and treating his clients fairly, he had grown the business into one of the most respected construction companies in our area, employing 15 full-time workers and handling everything from custom homes to commercial renovations. Our house was a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in the suburbs that Dad had actually built himself as a surprise for my mom before she got sick. It sat on 2 acres of land, complete with a pool that Dad had installed for my 13th birthday, a 3-car garage that housed his work truck, my car, and the classic Mustang he was restoring in his spare time. The property also included a workshop where Dad kept his tools and where he had taught me basic carpentry skills growing up. I could see the dollar signs in their eyes every time they looked around. Marcus would walk through the house touching things with a sense of ownership that made my skin crawl, making comments about how much everything must be worth. Stephanie would spend hours by the pool taking selfies, posting photos on social media as if she lived in some kind of mansion, and inviting her friends over without asking permission first. The shift in family dynamics was immediate and jarring. Before Linda and her children moved in, Dad and I had a comfortable routine. We would cook dinner together most nights, with him teaching me his favorite recipes that he had learned from my grandmother. We would watch old movies on Friday nights, work on the Mustang together on Saturday mornings, and spend Sunday afternoons hiking on the trails behind our property. It was peaceful and filled with the kind of easy conversation that comes from 2 people who truly know and love each other. After the wedding, our house became a completely different place. Linda immediately started rearranging things, claiming she was just making the space feel more like home for her children. She moved my mother's photos from the living room to my bedroom, saying they were too personal for common areas. She replaced my mom's favorite china in the dining room hutch with her own dishes. She even convinced Dad to paint over the height measurements he had been marking on the kitchen doorframe since I was a toddler, claiming the marks looked childish and unprofessional. Marcus and Stephanie acted like they owned the place from the moment they arrived. Marcus immediately claimed the largest guest bedroom and proceeded to turn it into what looked like a teenage boys' cave, despite being 24 years old. He covered the walls with posters of cars and women in bikinis, left dirty dishes everywhere, and played loud music at all hours. When I complained to Dad about the noise interfering with my sleep, Marcus would smirk and say I was being dramatic. Stephanie took over the basement recreation room, transforming it into her personal social club. She would invite groups of friends over without asking, and they would stay until the early hours of the morning, drinking, smoking, and making enough noise to wake the entire neighborhood. When neighbors started complaining, Linda would make excuses for her daughter, saying she was just young and needed time to adjust to the move. The worst part was watching how they treated Dad. Before the marriage, Linda had seemed to genuinely care about him, asking about his work, listening to his stories, and showing interest in his hobbies. But once the wedding was over and she had legal claim to his assets, her attitude changed completely. She would interrupt him when he was telling stories about the construction business, dismiss his concerns about household issues, and make decisions about his own home without consulting him. Marcus and Stephanie were even worse. They would ask Dad for money constantly: gas money, spending money, money for clothes, money for car repairs on vehicles they had damaged through careless driving. Dad, being the generous and loving man he was, rarely said no. He wanted to be a good stepfather and provide for his new family, but I could see how their constant demands were wearing him down, both financially and emotionally. They showed him no respect and no genuine affection. When Dad would try to share stories about his work or his past, they would openly look bored and change the subject. When he offered to teach Marcus some construction skills that could help him build a career, Marcus would make excuses about being too busy or not being interested in manual labor. When he suggested that Stephanie might want to consider going back to school, she would get defensive and accuse him of trying to control her life. But Dad loved me. Despite everything, despite the tension that sometimes filled our dinner table, despite Linda's obvious favoritism toward her own children, Dad always made sure I knew I was his priority. He would take me out for our traditional Saturday morning breakfast, just the two of us, and we would talk about everything: my job at the marketing firm, my dreams of starting my own business someday, and his plans for the future. Those Saturday mornings became even more precious when Dad got sick. It started with a persistent cough that he kept brushing off as just a cold that wouldn't go away. Dad had always been incredibly healthy and strong. He could work 12-hour days on construction sites and still have energy to help me with homework or work on house projects. Seeing him struggle with something as simple as climbing the stairs to his bedroom was terrifying. Being a stubborn 60-year-old man who had never been seriously ill in his life, he refused to see a doctor until the cough became so severe that he could barely speak without going into coughing fits. Linda finally forced him to go to urgent care on a Tuesday evening when he coughed up blood. I'll never forget the look of fear in his eyes when he saw those crimson spots on the tissue. The diagnosis hit us like a truck: stage 3 lung cancer that had already spread to his lymph nodes. Dad had never been a smoker, but the doctor explained that exposure to construction dust and chemicals over 25 years had likely contributed to the disease. The irony was cruel. The work he loved, the business he had built to provide for his family, had literally been killing him slowly. The doctors gave him 6 months to 2 years, depending on how well he responded to treatment. They recommended an aggressive combination of chemotherapy and radiation, warning us that the side effects would be severe and that there were no guarantees. Dad looked at me across that sterile hospital room and said he wanted to fight, that he wasn't ready to leave me yet. The next 18 months were a roller coaster of chemotherapy sessions, hospital stays, good days and bad days. The treatments were brutal. Dad would spend 3 days getting infusions that made him violently ill, then have 1 week to recover before starting the cycle again. He lost his thick gray hair, dropped 40 pounds from his already lean frame, and developed a permanent pallor that made him look decades older than his years. Through it all, I was there. I rearranged my work schedule to drive him to every appointment I could, often sitting in uncomfortable hospital chairs for hours while poison dripped into his veins in hopes of saving his life. I learned to manage his medications, coordinate with his doctors, and handle the insurance paperwork that seemed to multiply endlessly. When he was too weak to run his business, I stepped in to help with scheduling, client communications, and payroll, working late into the night to keep his company running smoothly. I watched my strong, capable father become fragile and dependent, and it broke my heart every single day. But I also saw his incredible courage and determination. Even on his worst days, when the chemo made him so sick he couldn't keep water down, he would ask me about my work, my friends, my dreams for the future. He never stopped being my dad, even when the cancer and treatments were stealing pieces of him away. Marcus and Stephanie, on the other hand, seemed more interested in making sure they were positioned to inherit everything than actually caring for their stepfather. They would visit him in the hospital occasionally, usually when Linda pressured them to come, but their visits were brief and uncomfortable. They would stand by his bed making awkward small talk for 10 minutes before finding excuses to leave. What hurt the most was seeing how their behavior affected Dad. He had welcomed them into his home and his heart, treating them like his own children despite the fact that they had never shown him genuine love or respect. Even as he was fighting for his life, he would ask me if I thought Marcus and Stephanie were okay, if there was anything he could do to help them feel more connected to the family. I started to notice disturbing changes in how they talked about Dad's condition. When he had good days and seemed to be responding well to treatment, they would seem almost disappointed. When he had setbacks or the doctors delivered discouraging news, I would catch them exchanging meaningful glances that made my stomach turn. It was as if they were rooting for the cancer instead of rooting for Dad. I remember one particularly difficult evening when Dad was having trouble breathing. Linda was out of town visiting her sister, and I was the one who rushed him to the emergency room at 2 a.m. Marcus and Stephanie were nowhere to be found. When I called them, Marcus said he had an important meeting in the morning and couldn't miss sleep, while Stephanie claimed she was too emotional to handle seeing Dad in that condition. That night, as I sat in the hospital waiting room, Dad reached for my hand with his weak grip and said something that would haunt me for months to come. "Emma, you're the only one who truly cares about me as a person, not just what I can give you. I want you to know that I've made sure you'll be taken care of when I'm gone. Promise me you won't let them push you around." I promised him, not really understanding what he meant at the time. I thought he was just being emotional because of the pain medication. But now I realize he knew exactly what was coming. Dad passed away on a Monday morning in October. I was holding his hand when he took his last breath. Linda was crying at his bedside, and Marcus and Stephanie arrived just as the nurses were covering his face with a sheet. Even in that moment of grief, I could see them exchanging meaningful looks with each other. The funeral was beautiful. Dad had a lot of friends and business associates who came to pay their respects. People told stories about his generosity, his work ethic, and his love for his family. I gave a eulogy about the man who raised me, who taught me to be strong and independent, and who showed me what unconditional love looked like. Through my tears, I noticed Marcus and Stephanie whispering to each other during the service, which struck me as incredibly disrespectful. After the burial, everyone came back to the house for the traditional gathering. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and just wanted to collapse in my childhood bedroom. That's when Linda approached me with a serious expression on her face. "Emma, we need to talk," she said, leading me into Dad's study. Marcus and Stephanie followed us, closing the door behind them. The atmosphere in the room immediately felt hostile. Linda sat down behind Dad's desk, a move that felt presumptuous and disrespectful so soon after his death. She pulled out a folder and placed it on the desk with a dramatic flourish. "Your father's will was very clear about his intentions," Linda said, her voice suddenly cold and businesslike. "This house, the business, and all assets go to me as his wife. Marcus and Stephanie will inherit everything when I pass away. As for you, Emma, your father left you $5,000 and asked that you find your own place within 30 days. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at her in disbelief, my mind struggling to process what she had just said. This couldn't be right. Dad had always told me that I would be taken care of, that this house would always be my home. That's impossible, I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Dad would never do that to me. This is my home. I've lived here since I was 8 years old. Marcus stepped forward with a smirk that made my stomach turn. Sorry, Emma, but facts are facts. Dad obviously realized that blood family comes first. You're not really his daughter anyway. You're just someone he felt obligated to take care of because of your mom. The cruelty of his words took my breath away. Stephanie nodded in agreement, her arms crossed over her chest. You can't really be surprised by this, Emma. Did you honestly think Dad would choose you over his real family? We're his wife and stepchildren. You're just a reminder of his past. I looked at the document Linda was waving around, but my eyes were too blurred with tears to read it properly. Something about it didn't feel right, but I was too shocked and grief-stricken to think clearly. I need time to process this, I said, standing up on shaky legs. I just buried my father. Can we please discuss this tomorrow? Linda's expression hardened even more. Actually, Emma, we've already been more than generous. We've decided that it would be best for everyone if you moved out today. We've packed your belongings. They're in boxes by the front door. Today? I repeated, incredulous. You want me to leave today? On the day of Dad's funeral? It's not personal, Emma, Marcus said, though his tone suggested it was very personal indeed. We just think a clean break is better for everyone. No point in dragging this out and making it more painful than it needs to be. I stumbled out of the study in a daze, and sure enough, there were several cardboard boxes stacked by the front door. My entire life had been reduced to a few hastily packed containers. I could see some of my clothes sticking out of one box, and my college textbooks in another. They had gone through my room and gathered my things while I was saying goodbye to my father at the cemetery. The remaining funeral guests were still milling around the living room, eating sandwiches and sharing memories of Dad. None of them knew what was happening. I felt like I was in a nightmare, surrounded by normalcy while my world was collapsing. Wait, I said, turning back to face my stepfamily. What about Dad's lawyer? Shouldn't he be here to read the will officially? This doesn't feel right. Linda exchanged a quick glance with Marcus before answering. Mr. Patterson is out of town this week. He already went over everything with us privately. This is all perfectly legal and proper. But I want to speak with him myself, I insisted, starting to find my voice again. I want to hear this from Dad's actual lawyer, not from you. That's when Stephanie lost her patience completely. Listen, Emma, you need to accept reality and stop making this harder than it has to be. Dad made his choice. He chose us. Now take your boxes and go. The finality in her voice was like a slap across the face. I looked around the room at the people I had considered family for the past 3 years, and all I saw were strangers who couldn't wait to get rid of me. I don't have anywhere to go, I said quietly. My job barely pays enough for rent in this area, and I don't have money saved for a security deposit. Can't you give me at least a week to figure something out? Marcus actually laughed at this. That's not our problem anymore, Emma. You're an adult. Figure it out outside. The rain had started coming down harder. I could hear it pelting against the windows. The irony wasn't lost on me. Even the weather seemed to be reflecting my misery. With as much dignity as I could muster, I started carrying my boxes out to my car. It was a 10-year-old Honda Civic that Dad had helped me buy when I graduated college. At least they couldn't take that away from me. The funeral guests watched in confusion as I made trip after trip, but I was too humiliated to explain what was happening. On my final trip, as I was loading the last box into my already overflowing car, Linda appeared at the door. Emma, she called out, her voice carrying across the front yard. You forgot this. She tossed something at me, and I caught it reflexively. It was my house key. The symbolism of that moment, having the key to my childhood home thrown at me like garbage, was almost too much to bear. I stood there in the pouring rain, completely soaked, staring at that key in my palm. Behind me, I could hear the door slam shut. Through the window, I could see Marcus and Stephanie watching me with expressions of smug satisfaction. I had nowhere to go. My closest friend Sarah lived in a tiny studio apartment across town, and I didn't want to burden her with my problems on such short notice. I ended up spending that first night in my car in a 24-hour diner parking lot, using their bathroom to clean up and buying coffee just to justify taking up space. But as I sat there in my car that night, something inside me started to shift. The initial shock and grief began to give way to anger. The more I thought about what had happened, the more things didn't add up. Dad had always been so careful about legal matters, especially regarding his business. Would he really have made such an important decision without involving his longtime lawyer? And why were Marcus and Stephanie so eager to get me out of the house immediately? I thought about that night in the hospital when Dad had squeezed my hand and promised I would be taken care of. The man I knew, the man who raised me, would never have left me with nothing. Something was very wrong here. The next morning, I drove straight to Dad's lawyer's office. Mr. Patterson had been handling Dad's legal affairs for over 15 years, and I knew him personally from various family events. When I walked into his office, still wearing yesterday's funeral clothes and probably looking like I hadn't slept, his secretary took one look at me and immediately called him out of his meeting. Emma, dear, what are you doing here? He asked, his kind eyes filled with concern. I heard about your father. I'm so sorry for your loss. He was a good man. Mr. Patterson, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I need to ask you about Dad's will. Linda showed me a document yesterday that doesn't seem right to me. His eyebrows furrowed in confusion. What document? Emma, I haven't spoken to Linda or her children about your father's will. In fact, I was planning to call you today to schedule a reading for next week. My heart started pounding. You mean you haven't already given them the will? Absolutely not, he said, looking increasingly concerned. The will reading hasn't taken place yet. Whatever Linda showed you, it certainly wasn't the official document. Do you have it with you? I shook my head, explaining how they had rushed me out of the house without giving me a chance to examine the papers properly. Mr. Patterson listened with growing alarm as I told him about being kicked out immediately after the funeral. Emma, this is highly irregular and potentially illegal, he said when I finished. Your father updated his will just 2 months ago, and I can tell you with certainty that its contents are very different from what you've described. He pulled out a thick folder from his file cabinet and placed it on his desk. This is your father's actual will, witnessed and notarized properly. Would you like me to go over the relevant sections with you? I nodded, my hands trembling with anticipation. Your father was very explicit about his wishes, Mr. Patterson continued, adjusting his reading glasses. The house at 1247 Maple Street is left jointly to you and Linda, with specific instructions that you are to have a home there for as long as you need it. The construction business is split 3 ways, 40% to you, 40% to Linda, and 20% to be divided between Marcus and Stephanie when they turn 30. I stared at him in shock. But that's not what Linda said at all. She told me everything goes to her, and that I only get $5,000. Mr. Patterson looked genuinely angry now. That's absolutely false. In addition to your inheritance of the house and business, your father set up a trust fund in your name worth approximately $200,000. The only thing Marcus and Stephanie inherit directly is $25,000 each, and only if they maintain respectful relationships with both you and Linda. The room seemed to spin around me. Everything Linda had told me was a lie. Everything Marcus and Stephanie had said about Dad choosing them over me was completely fabricated. Mr. Patterson, what Linda showed me. Could it have been a fake will? It's possible, he said grimly. What you're describing sounds like fraud, Emma. This is a serious crime. We need to involve the police immediately. Within an hour, I was sitting in the police station giving a statement to Detective Rodriguez. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude who took my story very seriously. What you're describing is estate fraud, which is a felony, she explained. If your stepfamily knowingly presented a false will and used it to illegally evict you from your own property, they could be facing significant jail time. She assigned an officer to accompany me back to the house to retrieve my belongings and to inform Linda that the will she had presented was fraudulent. As we drove through my old neighborhood, I felt a mixture of nervousness and vindication. We pulled up to the house just as Marcus was loading something into his truck. When he saw the police car, his face went pale. I watched with satisfaction as Officer Thompson approached him while Detective Rodriguez and I went to the front door. Linda answered the door with a confident smile that quickly faded when she saw me standing there with the police detective. Mrs. Henderson, Detective Rodriguez said formally, we need to discuss the will you presented to Miss Emma Carter yesterday. We have reason to believe it may have been fraudulent. I don't know what Emma has told you, Linda said, but everything was completely legal. I have the paperwork right here. She disappeared into the house and returned with the same folder she had shown me the day before. Detective Rodriguez examined the documents carefully, taking photos with her phone. These documents are clearly forged, the detective said after a few minutes. The letterhead is incorrect, the notary seal is fake, and the signature doesn't match the samples we have from Mr. Carter's actual attorney. Linda's face went through several expressions: shock, fear, and then defiance. I don't know what you're talking about. This is the will Robert left. Maybe his lawyer made a mistake. That's when Mr. Patterson stepped out of his car. He had followed us to serve as a witness to the confrontation. Linda's face went completely white when she saw him. Hello, Linda, Mr. Patterson said calmly. I understand you've been telling people that I gave you Robert's will. That's interesting, since I've never spoken to you about it. The game was up, and Linda knew it. Her shoulders sagged as the weight of her deception became clear. Behind her, I could see Stephanie peeking around the corner, her earlier confidence completely gone. Detective Rodriguez placed Linda under arrest for estate fraud while I watched from the driveway. The sight of my stepmother being led away in handcuffs felt surreal, but also deeply satisfying. Marcus tried to drive away in his truck, but Officer Thompson had already called for backup, and he was stopped at the end of the street. As the police cars drove away with my step-siblings and stepmother, I stood in front of the house that was rightfully mine. Mr. Patterson handed me a new set of keys. The locks had been changed as evidence of their intent to permanently exclude me from the property. "Welcome home, Emma," he said with a gentle smile. But the story doesn't end there. Over the next few weeks, as the police investigation continued, even more shocking details came to light. It turned out that Linda had been planning this scheme for months. They found drafts of the fake will on Marcus's computer, dating back to when Dad was first diagnosed with cancer. They had been planning to steal my inheritance from the moment they knew he was dying. Even worse, the investigation revealed that Linda had been slowly transferring money out of Dad's business accounts into her own name during his final months when he was too sick to pay close attention to the finances. She had stolen nearly $50,000 from the company while Dad was fighting for his life. The trial took place 6 months later, and those 6 months were some of the most difficult of my life. I had to relive the trauma of that terrible day over and over again as I prepared my testimony with the prosecutor. The legal process was exhausting and emotionally draining, but I was determined to see justice done for Dad and for myself. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Word had gotten around our small community about the case, and many of Dad's former clients and business associates came to show their support. I saw familiar faces from the construction crew, neighbors who had watched me grow up, and even some of my high school teachers. Their presence gave me strength when I felt like I might fall apart. I had to testify about what happened that day after the funeral, describing in painful detail how they had thrown me out in the rain and presented the fake will. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Ms. Chen, walked me through every moment of that horrible afternoon. I had to explain how I felt when Linda sat behind Dad's desk and delivered the devastating news, how Marcus and Stephanie had smirked at my pain, and how they had packed my belongings while I was saying goodbye to my father at the cemetery. The hardest part was describing the moment when Linda threw my house key at me in the rain. Several people in the courtroom gasped audibly when I recounted that detail. I could see some of the jurors looking disgusted, and I knew that image would stick with them throughout the trial. Ms. Chen painted a clear picture of a family that had preyed on a dying man and his grieving daughter. She presented evidence of their planning, their deception, and their complete lack of remorse. She showed the jury photos of me standing in the rain that day, soaked and holding boxes of my possessions, contrasted with photos of Marcus and Stephanie smiling and taking selfies in the house just hours later. Marcus and Stephanie tried to claim they had no idea the will was fake, that their mother had told them it was legitimate and they had simply believed her. Their lawyer, a public defender who seemed overwhelmed by the evidence against his clients, attempted to paint them as innocent victims of their mother's scheme. But the evidence on Marcus's computer proved otherwise. The digital forensics expert who testified was devastating to their defense. He had recovered multiple drafts of the fraudulent document from Marcus's hard drive, showing a clear progression from early attempts to more sophisticated forgeries. The timestamps showed that Marcus had been working on the fake will for weeks before Dad died, constantly refining it and researching legal language online. The expert also found browser history showing that Marcus had researched topics like how to forge signatures, what makes a will legally valid, and even how long estate fraud investigations typically take. The prosecution presented screenshots of his searches, which included disturbing queries like when do cancer patients usually die and how to contest a will in court. Linda's defense was even more pathetic and infuriating to watch. She claimed she had done it all for her children, that she was just trying to secure their future in a world that she felt was unfair to them. Her lawyer tried to paint her as a devoted mother who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of grief and confusion. But Ms. Chen systematically destroyed that narrative. She presented evidence of Linda's financial planning, showing how she had been moving money out of Dad's accounts for months before his death. She showed the jury bank records proving that Linda had transferred nearly $50,000 into her personal accounts while Dad was undergoing chemotherapy and too sick to monitor his finances closely. The prosecutor responded to Linda's claims about securing her children's future by pointing out that Dad had already provided generously for Marcus and Stephanie in his real will. She read aloud the actual provisions, showing that they would have inherited $25,000 each and a share of the business profits once they turned 30. But apparently, that wasn't enough for them. They wanted everything, and they wanted it immediately. The most damning evidence came from Linda's own phone records. The prosecution had obtained text messages between Linda and her children that showed their callous planning. There were messages from just days after Dad's diagnosis where Linda wrote to Marcus about how they needed to make sure Emma doesn't get her hands on everything. Another message from Stephanie to her mother read, "Dad won't last much longer. We need to be ready." Perhaps most disturbing were the messages they exchanged on the day of the funeral itself. While I was delivering Dad's eulogy and breaking down in tears talking about the man who had raised me, Linda was texting her children about the timing of their plan. One message from Marcus read, "Mom, stick to the script. Get her out fast before she can think too clearly." The jury looked horrified as these messages were read aloud in court. I watched Linda's face as her own words were used against her, and I saw no remorse, only anger at being caught. Marcus and Stephanie looked like they wanted to disappear into their chairs. When the verdicts came in, I felt a sense of justice that I hadn't experienced since Dad died. Linda was sentenced to 3 years in prison for estate fraud and embezzlement. Marcus got 2 years for his role in creating the fake documents. Stephanie received 18 months for conspiracy, even though she had played a smaller role in the actual crime. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when the judge ordered them to pay full restitution for all the money they had stolen, plus damages for the emotional distress they had caused me. The total amount came to over $75,000. I moved back into my childhood home that same week, and the experience was both triumphant and deeply emotional. Walking through those familiar rooms felt like reclaiming a piece of my soul that I thought I had lost forever. Every corner of the house held memories of Dad and our life together before Linda and her children had invaded our peaceful world. The first thing I did was restore the house to the way it had been when Dad was alive. I put my mother's photos back in their rightful places in the living room, returned her china to the dining room hutch, and even found the paint to recreate the height measurements on the kitchen door frame. Each small act of restoration felt like I was healing not just the house, but also my own wounded heart. I kept Dad's study exactly the way he had left it, except for one symbolic change. I removed the chair that Linda had so presumptuously occupied that terrible day and replaced it with the reading chair Dad had always preferred. It was an old leather recliner where he would sit in the evenings, reading construction magazines or working on estimates for upcoming projects. Sitting in that chair now, I could almost feel his presence with me. The basement recreation room needed a complete overhaul after Stephanie had essentially destroyed it during her parties. I spent weeks cleaning, repainting, and replacing furniture. I turned it back into the comfortable family space it had been before, with the pool table Dad had bought for my 16th birthday and the big screen TV where we used to watch football games together on Sunday afternoons. Marcus's former bedroom required the most work. The walls were damaged from the tape he had used to hang his inappropriate posters, and the carpet was stained and reeked of cigarettes and spilled beer. I decided to completely renovate the room, stripping it down to the studs and rebuilding it as a proper guest room. It was therapeutic work, using the construction skills Dad had taught me to literally erase the traces of Marcus's presence from our home. The construction business took significant work to rebuild, and the challenge was much greater than I had initially anticipated. Linda's theft had damaged several important client relationships, as contractors and suppliers had been left unpaid during Dad's final months when she was siphoning money from the accounts. I spent countless hours meeting with creditors, negotiating payment plans, and slowly rebuilding the trust that Dad had spent 25 years establishing. I had to start from scratch with some aspects of the business. Several of Dad's long-term employees had been forced to find other jobs during the chaos following his death, when paychecks were bouncing and no one knew who was actually in charge of the company. I worked tirelessly to bring back the best workers, offering signing bonuses and improved benefits to convince them to return. But Dad had taught me well, both through direct instruction and by example. I remembered countless evenings when he would bring me to job sites, explaining how to read blueprints, how to manage subcontractors, and most importantly, how to treat clients with honesty and respect. I also had the advantage of knowing many of his former clients personally, as they had watched me grow up and knew I shared Dad's values and work ethic. Within a year, we were not only back on track but actually growing beyond what the company had achieved even in Dad's prime. I hired 2 new project managers, both experienced professionals who had known and respected Dad, and expanded into residential renovations, something Dad had always wanted to try but had never had the time to pursue properly. The expansion into home renovations turned out to be incredibly successful. Many of our former commercial clients were homeowners who remembered the quality of Dad's work and were eager to hire us for their personal projects. Word spread quickly through the community about the high quality of our work and our fair pricing, and soon we had a waiting list of clients that stretched for months. I also implemented new business practices that Dad had talked about but never had the chance to try. I invested in better project management software, improved our safety protocols, and started offering design consultation services in addition to construction. The company began winning awards from local business organizations and contractor associations, recognition that I knew would have made Dad incredibly proud. Working in the construction industry as a young woman presented unique challenges that Dad and I had discussed extensively. Some clients and subcontractors initially questioned my authority or tried to go around me to speak with male employees. But I had learned from watching Dad that competence and professionalism ultimately win out over prejudice. I made sure I knew every detail of every project, could read blueprints better than most of my competitors, and never promised anything I couldn't deliver. The most satisfying moment came about 18 months after I took over the business, when we were awarded the contract to build a new community center for the town. It was the largest project we had ever undertaken, worth over $2 million, and the town council specifically mentioned their confidence in our company's integrity and track record when they announced the decision. I knew that Dad would have been bursting with pride to see his little company win such a prestigious contract. I also used part of the trust fund Dad had left me to start a scholarship program at the local community college for students studying construction and business management. The program was called the Robert Carter Memorial Scholarship, and it provided full tuition assistance for students who demonstrated both financial need and a genuine commitment to learning the trades that Dad had loved so much. The scholarship program became one of my most meaningful projects. I worked closely with the college to identify students who reminded me of Dad in his younger years, hardworking, honest, and determined to build something meaningful with their hands and minds. The first recipient was a single mother named Maria who was studying construction management while working 2 part-time jobs to support her children. When I presented her with the scholarship check, I told her about Dad and how he would have been proud to help someone with her dedication and spirit. Over the years, the scholarship program has helped dozens of students complete their education and start successful careers in construction and business. Many of them have gone on to work for our company or start their own businesses, creating a network of professionals who share Dad's values of hard work, integrity, and treating people fairly. It feels like Dad's legacy is living on through these young people, multiplying his positive impact on the world. About a year after the trial, I received an unexpected letter in the mail that brought back all the painful emotions I thought I had processed. It was from Stephanie, writing from the Women's Correctional Facility where she was serving her sentence. The letter was handwritten on plain white paper, and I could see that she had started and stopped several times, with crossed-out words and sentences throughout. In the letter, she apologized for everything that had happened and claimed she had been pressured by her mother and brother to go along with their scheme. She wrote about how she had been young and stupid, how she had been influenced by Marcus and Linda's greed, and how she realized now that what they had done was not just illegal but morally wrong. She described the guilt she felt about participating in the betrayal of a man who had welcomed her into his home and treated her like his own daughter. Stephanie also wrote about her life in prison, how she was taking classes to get her GED and participating in counseling programs to understand why she had made such terrible choices. She said she understood if I never wanted to see her again, but she hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive her someday. She ended the letter by saying that she thought about Dad often and wished she could have told him she was sorry before he died. I read that letter several times before deciding how to respond. Part of me was still angry about what they had put me through, about how they had stolen precious time with Dad's memory and forced me to fight for what should have been mine without question. But another part of me remembered the scared young woman who had just lost her stepfather and been manipulated by her own family members who were supposed to protect and guide her. After much consideration, I wrote back to Stephanie. I didn't offer forgiveness exactly, because I wasn't ready for that and wasn't sure I ever would be. But I acknowledged her apology and expressed hope that she was sincere about changing her life. I told her about the scholarship program and how I was working to honor Dad's memory in positive ways. I also encouraged her to continue her education and counseling, because I genuinely believed that people could change if they were willing to do the hard work of examining their choices and making better ones. The construction business took significant work to rebuild, and the challenge was much greater than I had initially anticipated. Linda's theft had damaged several important client relationships, as contractors and suppliers had been left unpaid during Dad's final months when she was siphoning money from the accounts. I spent countless hours meeting with creditors, negotiating payment plans, and slowly rebuilding the trust that Dad had spent 25 years establishing. I had to start from scratch with some aspects of the business. Several of Dad's long-term employees had been forced to find other jobs during the chaos following his death, when paychecks were bouncing and no one knew who was actually in charge of the company. I worked tirelessly to bring back the best workers, offering signing bonuses and improved benefits to convince them to return. But Dad had taught me well, both through direct instruction and by example. I remembered countless evenings when he would bring me to job sites, explaining how to read blueprints, how to manage subcontractors, and most importantly, how to treat clients with honesty and respect. I also had the advantage of knowing many of his former clients personally, as they had watched me grow up and knew I shared Dad's values and work ethic. Within a year, we were not only back on track but actually growing beyond what the company had achieved even in Dad's prime. I hired 2 new project managers, both experienced professionals who had known and respected Dad, and expanded into residential renovations, something Dad had always wanted to try but had never had the time to pursue properly. The expansion into home renovations turned out to be incredibly successful. Many of our former commercial clients were homeowners who remembered the quality of Dad's work and were eager to hire us for their personal projects. Word spread quickly through the community about the high quality of our work and our fair pricing, and soon we had a waiting list of clients that stretched for months. I also implemented new business practices that Dad had talked about but never had the chance to try. I invested in better project management software, improved our safety protocols, and started offering design consultation services in addition to construction. The company began winning awards from local business organizations and contractor associations, recognition that I knew would have made Dad incredibly proud. Working in the construction industry as a young woman presented unique challenges that Dad and I had discussed extensively. Some clients and subcontractors initially questioned my authority or tried to go around me to speak with male employees. But I had learned from watching Dad that competence and professionalism ultimately win out over prejudice. I made sure I knew every detail of every project, could read blueprints better than most of my competitors, and never promised anything I couldn't deliver. The most satisfying moment came about 18 months after I took over the business, when we were awarded the contract to build a new community center for the town. It was the largest project we had ever undertaken, worth over $2 million, and the town council specifically mentioned their confidence in our company's integrity and track record when they announced the decision. I knew that Dad would have been bursting with pride to see his little company win such a prestigious contract. I also used part of the trust fund Dad had left me to start a scholarship program at the local community college for students studying construction and business management. The program was called the Robert Carter Memorial Scholarship, and it provided full tuition assistance for students who demonstrated both financial need and a genuine commitment to learning the trades that Dad had loved so much. The scholarship program became one of my most meaningful projects. I worked closely with the college to identify students who reminded me of Dad in his younger years, hardworking, honest, and determined to build something meaningful with their hands and minds. The first recipient was a single mother named Maria who was studying construction management while working 2 part-time jobs to support her children. When I presented her with the scholarship check, I told her about Dad and how he would have been proud to help someone with her dedication and spirit. Over the years, the scholarship program has helped dozens of students complete their education and start successful careers in construction and business. Many of them have gone on to work for our company or start their own businesses, creating a network of professionals who share Dad's values of hard work, integrity, and treating people fairly. It feels like Dad's legacy is living on through these young people, multiplying his positive impact on the world. About a year after the trial, I received an unexpected letter in the mail that brought back all the painful emotions I thought I had processed. It was from Stephanie, writing from the women's correctional facility where she was serving her sentence. The letter was handwritten on plain white paper, and I could see that she had started and stopped several times, with crossed-out words and sentences throughout. In the letter, she apologized for everything that had happened and claimed she had been pressured by her mother and brother to go along with their scheme. She wrote about how she had been young and stupid, how she had been influenced by Marcus and Linda's greed, and how she realized now that what they had done was not just illegal but morally wrong. She described the guilt she felt about participating in the betrayal of a man who had welcomed her into his home and treated her like his own daughter. Stephanie also wrote about her life in prison, how she was taking classes to get her GED and participating in counseling programs to understand why she had made such terrible choices. She said she understood if I never wanted to see her again, but she hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive her someday. She ended the letter by saying that she thought about Dad often and wished she could have told him she was sorry before he died. I read that letter several times before deciding how to respond. Part of me was still angry about what they had put me through, about how they had stolen precious time with Dad's memory and forced me to fight for what should have been mine without question. But another part of me remembered the scared young woman who had just lost her stepfather and been manipulated by her own family members who were supposed to protect and guide her. After much consideration, I wrote back to Stephanie. I didn't offer forgiveness exactly, because I wasn't ready for that and wasn't sure I ever would be. But I acknowledged her apology and expressed hope that she was sincere about changing her life. I told her about the scholarship program and how I was working to honor Dad's memory in positive ways. I also encouraged her to continue her education and counseling, because I genuinely believed that people could change if they were willing to do the hard work of examining their choices and making better ones. Looking back now, I realized that Dad's promise to take care of me wasn't just about money or property. He had raised me to be strong enough to fight for myself when the time came. He had given me the tools and the character I needed to survive their betrayal and come out stronger on the other side. The house at 1247 Maple Street is still my home, but now it truly feels like mine. Every room holds memories of Dad, but they are no longer overshadowed by the presence of people who never belonged there in the first place. I've painted the walls, updated the kitchen, and even added a small garden in the backyard where I grow the tomatoes Dad always loved. And when people ask me about that terrible day when my step-siblings threw me out in the rain after Dad's funeral, I tell them it was the day I learned the difference between family and strangers who happened to share your address. It was the day I discovered that truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how hard people try to bury it. And it was the day I proved to myself that I was stronger than I ever imagined. Justice may not always be swift, but when it comes, it's usually more complete than you expected. Linda, Marcus, and Stephanie thought they could steal my inheritance and my home while I was at my most vulnerable. Instead, they lost everything: their freedom, their reputations, and any chance of being part of a real family. As for me, I gained something much more valuable than money or property. I gained the unshakable knowledge that I can handle whatever life throws at me, and that sometimes the people who try to tear you down end up making you stronger than you ever thought possible. That's my story, how my step-siblings threw me out in the rain after Dad's funeral, and how I returned with the police and the real will to reclaim everything they tried to steal. But more than that, it's the story of how I learned that real family doesn't abandon you in your darkest hour, and how sometimes the worst betrayal can lead to the greatest victory.